In this CBT Techniques Made Simple, we're going to be covering the technique of making a cost-benefit analysis in challenging a person's thought and their thinking. There's a couple ways of doing this one. Number one, before getting into the technique, putting a couple things on the table. Many people don't really think of their thoughts as something that they can buy into. You have the thought, it just pops up. People automatically think that there is a reality to the thoughts they're having, and more or less just take it on as is. Number two, even if a person is assuming that there's some wiggle room here, thinking is not always a reflection of reality, there isn't necessarily this feeling people have of being able to just not buy a thought. In the same way, and a nice metaphor, in the same way, sometimes in big cities you have folks, walking up to tourists, they're holding all these wristwatches and perfumes, Lord knows how they came across them, and they try and pawn them off, selling them for cheap. We don't automatically assume we have to buy those things. In fact, most people see those and steer clear. There's nothing compelling us to purchase those things, and in the same way, thoughts are a lot like that. If it's not worth the cost, why buy it? So, having put those two things on the table here, when clients are coming in with different problems, it is well worth the time just to sit down and say, listen, we're going to sort out here, well, what benefits and what disadvantages do you have with having that thought? Treating it, even from the get-go, as though it's not something we just assume is real. And like I said, that second point, that thoughts are something we either buy or we don't. Getting this technique going, simply asking in a straightforward way, well, what are the costs and what are the benefits of having this particular thought? Another question you can ask is, are there any advantages to have this thought? Do you lose anything having this thought? Or you can get a little more sophisticated and say, listen, obviously you're going to have both costs and benefits. Are there more costs? Are there more benefits? 40-60, 70-80? That's one way of going about this technique. Another way is, all right, sitting with your client, fine, we've identified the thought, we've identified the worry that the client has. The thought that they have is, they don't want to go on the next date, they've been set up with, and they're just going to stay home. That's their thought. The worry they have is that they're going to be rejected. Okay. So taking that thought, well, let's make a column here, two columns, in the middle, one side we're going to have advantages, the other side disadvantages, and we're just going to list off as many as we can either way. A lot of people are going to have, like I said, a bit of a hesitancy because there is that knee-jerk reaction of we just buy the feeling, I don't want to go on the date. And you don't want to get into a power struggle with the client. It's fair enough, you don't want to do it. We're just popping open the hood here to figure out what's behind that thinking. This has nothing to do with what you're going to end up physically doing. It's just worth knowing what's going on in the psychological engine. So avoiding that defense, you can go ahead and push forward with the technique. A little more sophisticated way of pulling out this technique is instead of making just two columns, you actually make four, where you're setting up the question in both the positive and the negative. It seems repetitive, and sometimes it is, depending upon who the client is, so you have to have a feel for who you're working with. But I found in my experience that people generally think differently when the question is put in the positive as opposed to the negative, and you'll come away with a couple key insights that could really crack open the case and help out your client. So what I mean by this is you have the question, going out on a date, yes or no. That would be the two questions. And then you'd have pro, con. And you just fill in the boxes. Like I said, a lot of overlap generally, but 9 times out of 10, when you get to the opposite, the no, or it's bad to go out on a date, you come up with a lot more. So once you have this all laid out, the client starts to see that there's the brain is tricking him into making these choices that are actually against his values, that are actually against what he wants. People generally do want to find true love. People do generally want to get married, and the only way to do that is, well, you got to go on the date, man. And that realization oftentimes gets covered over by intense emotions, fear, anxiety, and what those things are generally pushing a person out of the life that they'd actually want to live. And by putting it on a piece of paper, seeing it in black and white, a person is able to better intellectually tackle this problem, make the choices that are right for him, living up to the values they actually have. A couple problems that come up with this technique. Number one, there's a sort of rigidity, like I mentioned before, that, well, this is my thought and that's just the way it is. Like I said, simply saying, okay, you really, like, this is not about forcing you to do anything. That's not my job. I don't want to force you to do anything. My purpose here is just to understand better what is motivating you, to open up what your wants, what your true values are, and to push in that direction. And that's one way of tackling that problem. Another possible problem is that a person will end up only having pros or only having cons. This is indicative of black and white thinking. Nothing is perfect. If you don't have a complaint, something's wrong. And if you don't see the silver lining, again, something's wrong. That we're not seeing the whole living picture. So when you're confronted with that particular problem, simply pushing ahead, kind of poking, or can you think of anything? Anything come to mind? Offering suggestions, possible, not just single suggestions, but you always kind of want to, is it this or is it that? Could it be this? Could it be that? To make sure that the person you're speaking with is still making choices, is still thinking through their thoughts. You don't want to take control of that process. Sometimes you might have to, granted, but again, erring on the side of caution. You never want to lead the witness. It's better always to give 2, 3, 4 alternatives to get the wheels moving, get the client thinking about the situation. So I hope this video was helpful. If you like it, go ahead and give it a like. I'd love to hear your comments about how this technique has been useful in your practice. If you have any insights of how to pull this technique off better, what approach works best for you, I'd love to hear it. And go ahead and check out my website and my Patreon account if you want to continue to support my work that I'm doing here. I'll see you in the next video.